The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble courtyard of Buckingham Palace as guard Marcus Thompson adjusted his red tunic for the third time. 28 years old and standing at attention for nearly 2 hours, he had perfected the art of remaining motionless while tourists snapped photos just feet away. His black bearskin hat sat heavy on his head, and sweat trickled down his spine beneath the thick wool uniform. But Marcus never flinched. Royal protocol was everything in his world. Every step, every glance, every breath was governed by centuries-old traditions that could never be broken. Marcus had spent 3 years learning these rules, memorizing every regulation in the manual until they became second nature. Never speak unless spoken to by a superior officer. Never acknowledge the public. Never, under any circumstances, break formation or leave your post without direct orders. The tourists loved trying to make the guards react. Children would jump up and down in front of them, adults would tell jokes, and teenagers would pose for selfies while making silly faces. Marcus had seen it all, and nothing could disturb his professional composure. His fellow guards often joked that he was made of stone, completely unshakable in any situation. That Tuesday morning started like any other. The changing of the guard ceremony had concluded 30 minutes earlier, and Marcus had taken his position at the main entrance. His rifle was positioned perfectly, his posture rigid and correct. The stream of tourists began their usual antics, but Marcus remained focused on a point somewhere in the distance, his face expressionless. Around 11 o'clock, something caught his peripheral vision. A young woman was approaching the palace gates, moving differently than the typical tourist. While others wandered aimlessly with cameras and guidebooks, she walked with purpose, her steps deliberate and confident. She wore a simple dark coat and carried what appeared to be a small bundle wrapped in white cloth. Marcus tried to dismiss the observation, refocusing on his duty to remain still and alert. But something about her presence felt different. She wasn't taking pictures or chatting excitedly with companions. Instead, she seemed nervous, constantly looking over her shoulder as if checking whether someone was following her. Her knuckles were white from gripping the bundle so tightly. The woman stopped about 20 feet from Marcus's position and appeared to be gathering courage for something. She took several deep breaths and kept adjusting her grip on whatever she was carrying. Other tourists moved around her, but she remained frozen in that spot, staring directly at the palace entrance. Marcus had been trained to identify potential security threats, and his instincts were telling him something was unusual about this situation. However, royal protocol dictated that he could not abandon his post or speak unless there was an immediate and obvious danger. The woman wasn't displaying any aggressive behavior or making threats. She was simply standing there, holding her mysterious bundle. After several minutes, the woman began walking closer to the palace gates. With each step, Marcus could see more details about what she was carrying. The white cloth appeared to be some kind of blanket or towel, and the way she held it suggested the contents were fragile. Her movements were protective, almost maternal, as she cradled the bundle against her chest. Other guards had noticed her unusual behavior as well. Marcus could sense the slight tension in their formation, though none of them moved or spoke. They were all bound by the same strict protocols that had governed palace security for generations. Unless given specific orders or faced with an immediate threat, they were to remain at their posts regardless of what happened around them. The woman reached the gates and stopped again. She looked up at the palace windows as if hoping to see someone, then down at her bundle with an expression that Marcus could only describe as desperate. Her lips were moving as if she was talking to herself or perhaps to whatever she was carrying. Tears were beginning to form in her eyes. Marcus felt his professional training at war with his human instincts. Every fiber of his being wanted to break protocol and ask if she needed help, but 3 years of discipline held him in place. Royal guards did not abandon their duties for personal feelings, no matter how compelling the situation might appear. The morning crowd of tourists was growing larger, and many were beginning to notice the woman's strange behavior. Some pointed and whispered among themselves, while others took photos of what they probably assumed was some kind of performance or protest. The woman seemed oblivious to the attention she was attracting, completely focused on her internal struggle. Marcus, continued watching from the corner of his eye, his training allowing him to maintain his rigid posture while staying alert to the developing situation. The woman's distress was becoming more obvious with each passing minute. She was now crying openly, and her whole body was shaking as she held the bundle. Something was clearly wrong, but Marcus found himself paralyzed by the very protocols that had been drilled into him since his first day of service. The Royal Guard manual covered dozens of scenarios, from terrorist attacks to medical emergencies, but nothing had prepared him for this moment of watching someone in obvious emotional distress while being unable to respond. The woman took another step closer to the gates, and that's when Marcus saw something that would challenge everything he thought he knew about following orders. The white bundle in her arms moved slightly, and he realized with shocking clarity what she was carrying. The weight of this discovery hit him like a physical blow, and for the first time in his career as a Royal Guard, Marcus Thompson felt his legendary composure beginning to crack. His breathing became slightly irregular, and his hands tightened, almost imperceptibly, around his rifle. The situation had suddenly become far more complex than any scenario covered in his training manual, and Marcus knew that the next few minutes would test not only his commitment to royal protocol but also his fundamental humanity. The small movement from within the white bundle confirmed Marcus's worst fears. The woman was carrying a baby, and from her desperate behavior, it was clear that something was terribly wrong. His mind raced through the possibilities while his body remained frozen in position. Was the child sick? Had something happened that drove her to bring the baby to the palace gates? Marcus had never been a father himself, but he had younger siblings and understood the protective instincts that came with caring for a child. The woman's tears were flowing freely now, and she was rocking back and forth while whispering to the bundle. Other tourists were beginning to gather at a respectful distance, sensing the gravity of the situation even if they didn't understand what was happening. The Royal Protocol Manual had strict guidelines about maintaining position during emotional displays from the public. Guards were not to be moved by tears, pleas, or dramatic gestures from tourists or protesters. These rules existed for good reason, as the guards could not be expected to respond to every person who approached the palace with a sad story or desperate request. But this felt different from anything Marcus had encountered before. Through his peripheral vision, he could see that the woman was becoming increasingly agitated. She kept looking between the palace windows and the bundle in her arms, as if trying to make an impossible decision. Her whole body language suggested someone who had reached the end of their options and was considering something drastic. Marcus began to wonder about her story. How had she ended up at the palace gates with a baby, clearly in distress? Was she homeless? Had she lost her job and couldn't provide for her child? Or was this something more immediate, like a medical emergency that required urgent attention? The not knowing was almost worse than the certainty that something was wrong. The woman suddenly looked directly at Marcus, making eye contact for the first time. Her face was streaked with tears, and her expression was a mixture of hope and desperation that cut straight through his professional armor. She seemed to be silently pleading with him, as if she believed that somehow, if she could just make him understand, he might be able to help. Marcus felt sweat breaking out across his forehead, not from the physical demands of standing at attention, but from the emotional pressure of the moment. His heart was beating faster, and he could feel the first cracks forming in the mental discipline that had served him so well for 3 years. Every instinct he possessed was screaming at him to break formation and find out what was wrong. The woman took another step forward, now close enough that Marcus could hear her speaking. She was talking to the baby in soft, soothing tones, but he could catch fragments of what she was saying. Words like safe and better life and no other choice drifted across the distance between them. The pieces of her story were beginning to form a picture that made Marcus's stomach tighten with dread. Other guards in the formation were showing subtle signs of tension as well. Marcus could sense their discomfort without looking directly at them. This was exactly the kind of situation their training had tried to prepare them for, yet none of them felt prepared at all. They were caught between their duty to remain at their posts and their natural human desire to help someone in obvious need. The crowd of tourists was growing larger, and some were beginning to take pictures and videos of the scene. Marcus realized that whatever happened next would likely be captured and shared around the world within hours. The thought of being part of a viral video where royal guards stood motionless while a woman and baby suffered was almost unbearable. But even worse than the public scrutiny was his own internal conflict. Marcus had joined the royal guard because he believed in service and duty. He wanted to protect people and be part of something larger than himself. Now he was faced with a situation where following his orders might mean failing to protect someone who desperately needed help. The woman was now close enough to the gate that she could probably pass the baby through the bars if she wanted to. The terrible possibility occurred to Marcus that she might be planning to abandon the child at the palace, hoping that royal staff would ensure the baby received proper care. The thought of watching helplessly as she walked away after leaving her child behind was almost more than he could bear. His breathing was becoming more irregular and small beads of sweat were visible on his forehead. Marcus Thompson, the guard who had never been shaken by anything, was beginning to lose his legendary composure. 3 years of perfect discipline were being tested by a woman and a baby who represented everything his training had never prepared him to handle. The woman looked up at the palace one more time, then back down at the bundle in her arms. She appeared to be having a conversation with herself, weighing options that Marcus couldn't even imagine. Her body language suggested someone who was about to make a decision that would change everything, and Marcus found himself holding his breath as he waited to see what would happen next. The moment stretched on, with tourists watching, guards maintaining their positions, and one desperate woman trying to decide what to do with the precious bundle in her arms. Marcus realized that he was witnessing something that would stay with him for the rest of his life, regardless of how it ended. The question now was whether he would be able to live with himself if he did nothing while tragedy unfolded just feet away from where he stood. The woman suddenly began moving toward the palace gates with renewed determination. Marcus watched in growing alarm as she approached the ornate iron bars that separated the public from the royal grounds. Her movements were purposeful now, no longer hesitant or uncertain. She had made her decision, and Marcus could see in her face that she was committed to whatever course of action she had chosen. She reached the gates and carefully positioned the bundle near the bars. The white cloth had shifted slightly, and Marcus could now see a tiny hand emerging from the wrapping. The sight hit him like a physical blow, and he felt his carefully maintained composure slip another notch. This was a real baby, probably only a few months old, and it was being placed at the gates of Buckingham Palace by a desperate mother. The woman began speaking to the bundle in urgent whispers, and Marcus caught more words this time. She was saying, "Goodbye." The realization struck him with devastating clarity. She was planning to leave her child at the palace gates and disappear. In her mind, this was probably the only way to ensure the baby would be safe and cared for. Marcus's training told him to remain at his post and let the proper authorities handle the situation. Palace security would eventually notice what was happening and respond according to established protocols. The child would be taken into protective custody, and social services would be contacted. Everything would be handled through the proper channels, just as the manual dictated. But his human heart was telling him something completely different. This was not just a security incident to be managed by proper authorities. This was a mother making the most desperate decision a parent could face, and a baby whose entire future was being decided in this moment. The proper channels might not be fast enough, and they certainly wouldn't address the human tragedy playing out before his eyes. The woman was now crying harder as she prepared to place the bundle at the base of the gates. Her movements were gentle and careful, as if she was tucking the baby into bed rather than abandoning it in a public place. She kept looking around nervously, probably worried that someone would try to stop her before she could complete her plan. Marcus felt his hands beginning to tremble almost imperceptibly. 3 years of rigid discipline were being challenged by the most basic human emotions: compassion, protectiveness, and the instinct to help someone in desperate need. His fellow guards probably couldn't see his internal struggle, but Marcus knew that he was approaching a breaking point. The crowd of tourists had grown larger, and some were beginning to realize what was happening. Marcus could hear whispered conversations in multiple languages as people tried to understand the scene unfolding before them. A few were taking photos, which made the situation even more difficult to bear. This private family tragedy was becoming a public spectacle. The woman carefully placed the bundle at the base of the gates and stood back up. She looked at the baby one more time, then began backing away slowly. Her face was a mask of pain and determination, the expression of someone forcing herself to do something that went against every maternal instinct she possessed. Marcus watched in horror as she turned and began walking away. She was actually going through with it. She was going to leave her baby at the palace gates and disappear into the crowd of tourists. In a matter of minutes, a helpless infant would be alone and abandoned, dependent on the mercy of strangers to ensure its survival. The guard's legendary composure finally cracked. Marcus couldn't stand by and watch this happen without at least trying to intervene. Royal protocol be damned. There was a baby involved, and his humanity wouldn't allow him to remain passive any longer. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice cutting through the morning air like a gunshot. The single word shattered 3 years of perfect silence and discipline. Every head in the vicinity turned to look at him, including those of his fellow guards, who stared in shock at this unprecedented breach of protocol. The woman stopped walking and turned around slowly, her eyes wide with surprise. She had probably assumed that the guards were just decorative figures, incapable of speech or human interaction. The fact that one of them had actually spoken to her seemed to give her hope and terror in equal measure. Marcus felt the weight of everyone's stares, from the tourists to his fellow guards to the security cameras that he knew were recording everything. He had just violated one of the most fundamental rules of his service, and there would certainly be consequences. But looking at the tiny bundle on the ground and the desperate woman who was walking away from it, he knew he couldn't have remained silent. "Please don't leave," he said, his voice stronger now that he had committed to breaking protocol. "Whatever's wrong, there might be another way to handle this. The baby needs you." The woman's face crumpled with fresh tears, and she took a few steps back toward the gates. Marcus could see the war between hope and despair playing out in her expression. She wanted to believe that there might be alternatives to abandoning her child, but something had driven her to this desperate act. Marcus realized that he was now in completely uncharted territory. His training had never covered what to do after breaking protocol to help a civilian. He was making up the rules as he went along, guided only by his instincts and his determination not to let this situation end in tragedy. The next few minutes would determine whether his decision to speak up would save this family or make everything worse. The woman stood frozen between the gates and the crowd of tourists, clearly torn between her original plan and the unexpected intervention from the royal guard. Marcus could see the internal struggle playing out across her face as she looked back and forth between him and the bundle on the ground. For the first time in days, weeks, or maybe months, someone was offering her a different option. "I can't," she whispered, her voice barely audible across the distance. "I have no money, no job, no place to live. She deserves better than what I can give her." Her words confirmed Marcus's worst fears about her situation, but also gave him hope that she genuinely wanted what was best for her child. Marcus felt the stares of his fellow guards burning into him, but he couldn't back down now. He had already broken the most sacred rule of royal protocol by speaking, and there was no point in trying to pretend it hadn't happened. His career might be over, but at least he could try to prevent a mother and child from being separated forever. "There are people who can help," he said, trying to project calm authority despite having no idea what resources were actually available. "Social services, charities, government programs. You don't have to do this alone, and you don't have to give up your baby." The crowd of tourists had grown substantially, and Marcus realized that they were now the center of a very public drama. Phones were recording everything, and he knew that within hours, videos of a royal guard breaking protocol would be all over social media. The thought made him nervous, but not enough to stop him from trying to help. Palace security had finally noticed the unusual situation developing at the main gates. Marcus could see several plainclothes officers moving through the crowd, trying to assess the threat level and determine how to respond. Their arrival added a new layer of complexity to an already difficult situation. The woman noticed the approaching security officers as well, and panic flashed across her face. She probably thought they were coming to arrest her for trying to abandon her child at the palace. She took a step toward the baby, as if she might grab the bundle and run. "It's okay," Marcus called out quickly, trying to prevent her from fleeing. "They're here to help, not to hurt you. No one is going to arrest you for being in a difficult situation." One of the security officers reached Marcus's position and spoke quietly to him. "Guard Thompson, you need to return to protocol immediately. We'll handle this situation according to established procedures." Marcus looked at the officer, then back at the woman and her baby. He knew that returning to protocol meant resuming his silent, motionless stance and letting others take over. But he also knew that the woman had responded to his personal intervention in a way she might not respond to official procedures. "Sir, with respect, I think she'll listen to me," Marcus replied quietly. "She was about to leave her baby and disappear. If we approach this like a standard security incident, she might bolt, and we'll never see either of them again." The security officer looked frustrated but seemed to recognize the validity of Marcus's point. The woman was clearly fragile and might react badly to being surrounded by official personnel. Sometimes the human touch was more effective than proper procedures. Meanwhile, the woman had moved closer to her baby again, hovering protectively over the bundle. She was watching the interaction between Marcus and the security officer with obvious anxiety, probably trying to decide whether she should trust them or run. "What's your name?" Marcus called out to her, ignoring the disapproving look from the security officer. If he was going to help her, he needed to establish some kind of personal connection. "Sarah," she answered after a moment's hesitation. "Sarah Mitchell." "Sarah, I'm Marcus. I want you to know that whatever brought you here today, there are people who want to help you and your baby, but we can't do that if you disappear." Sarah looked down at the baby, then back up at Marcus. For the first time since he had first noticed her, she seemed to have a glimmer of hope in her eyes. The fact that someone was treating her like a human being rather than a problem to be solved was clearly making a difference. "She's only 3 months old," Sarah said, her voice stronger now. "Her name is Emma. I've been living in my car for 2 weeks and I haven't eaten in 3 days. I thought if I brought her here, someone important would take care of her." The security officer stepped forward, his manner much gentler now that he understood the situation. "Sarah, we can get you both food and shelter today. There are emergency services available and we can help you access them. But first, let's get Emma somewhere warm and safe." Marcus felt a wave of relief as he saw Sarah's posture relax slightly. She was beginning to believe that there might be alternatives to abandoning her child. The crisis wasn't over yet, but at least she was willing to listen to options. "Can I pick her up?" Sarah asked, looking at the bundle on the ground. "I just wanted to make sure she was safe before I left." "Of course," the security officer said. "She's your baby, Sarah. Our job is to help you take care of her, not to take her away from you." Sarah carefully picked up the bundle and cradled it against her chest. The relief on her face was profound, as if she had been holding her breath for weeks and could finally exhale. Marcus realized that she had probably been fighting the urge to give up her child for much longer than just today. The immediate crisis had passed, but Marcus knew that the real work of helping Sarah and Emma was just beginning. More importantly, he knew that his decision to break protocol had fundamentally changed his relationship with the Royal Guard. There would be consequences for his actions, but looking at Sarah holding her baby safely in her arms, he knew he had made the right choice. Within minutes of the security officer's arrival, the scene at the palace gates had transformed from a potential tragedy into a coordinated rescue operation. Additional personnel had arrived, including a social worker who specialized in emergency, family services, and a paramedic who could assess both Sarah and baby Emma's immediate health needs. Marcus remained at his post, but the rigid formality of his stance had been replaced by something more human. He watched as Sarah was gently guided to a nearby security office where she could sit down and receive proper assistance. The crowd of tourists was being dispersed by additional security personnel, though many were still taking photos and videos of the unprecedented scene. The social worker, a middle-aged woman named Janet Collins, had extensive experience dealing with families in crisis. She approached Sarah with the kind of calm professionalism that came from years of handling desperate situations. Marcus could see Sarah responding positively to Janet's non-judgmental manner and gentle questions. "When did you last have a proper meal?" Janet asked, settling into a chair across from Sarah. The question was simple but revealed the depth of Sarah's situation. Her hesitant answer confirmed that she had been struggling with basic necessities for much longer than just the past few days. The paramedic, meanwhile, was conducting a preliminary examination of baby Emma. Marcus felt his heart clench as he watched the medical professional check the infant's vital signs and overall condition. Emma appeared to be healthy despite the difficult circumstances, but the paramedic was thorough in his assessment. "The baby seems to be in good shape considering everything," the paramedic reported to Janet. "She's a little underweight, probably, due to insufficient nutrition, but nothing that proper feeding and care can't address quickly." Marcus felt a surge of relief at this news. One of his biggest fears had been that Emma might be seriously ill or malnourished beyond help. The fact that she was fundamentally healthy meant that Sarah's desperate decision to bring her to the palace had been motivated by poverty and homelessness rather than medical crisis. Sarah was now telling her story to Janet, and Marcus found himself straining to hear the details despite knowing he should probably focus on resuming his guard duties. The fragments he caught painted a picture of a young single mother who had been overwhelmed by circumstances beyond her control. She had lost her job at a cleaning company 6 weeks earlier when the business went bankrupt. Without steady income, she couldn't pay rent and had been evicted from her small apartment. Her parents had died in a car accident 2 years earlier, and she had no siblings or other family members who could help. Friends had offered temporary assistance, but their resources were limited. "I've been applying for jobs every day," Sarah explained, her voice gaining strength as she talked. "But it's hard to interview when you're living in your car with a baby. I look tired, I smell like I haven't showered, and Emma sometimes cries during phone calls with potential employers." Janet nodded with understanding. She had seen this cycle before, people who needed jobs to get housing, but needed housing to get jobs. It was a trap that was difficult to escape without outside intervention. "The good news is that there are emergency programs specifically designed to help people in your situation," Janet said. "We can get you into temporary housing today, and there are job training programs that include childcare services. It won't be easy, but you don't have to face this alone anymore." Marcus felt his chest tighten with emotion as he listened to this conversation. Sarah's situation was exactly the kind of crisis that social safety nets were designed to address. But somehow she had fallen through the cracks until desperation drove her to the palace gates. The thought of how close she had come to giving up her child was almost unbearable. The security officer who had initially responded to the situation approached Marcus quietly. "Guard Thompson, we need to discuss what happened here today. Breaking protocol is a serious matter that requires a formal review." Marcus nodded, knowing this conversation was inevitable. "I understand, sir. I'm prepared to face whatever consequences are appropriate, but I want you to know that I'd make the same decision again if faced with a similar situation." The officer studied Marcus for a moment, then looked over at Sarah and Emma, who were now receiving the help they desperately needed. "The thing is, Thompson, your actions today might have prevented a tragedy that would have reflected badly on all of us. Sometimes doing the right thing and following protocol aren't the same thing." This response surprised Marcus. He had expected immediate disciplinary action, not philosophical reflection on the nature of duty and service. The officer seemed to be struggling with the same conflict between rules and humanity that Marcus had experienced. "We'll need to file a full report." "Of course," the officer continued, "but I'm going to recommend that your actions be reviewed in the context of the positive outcome they achieved. You may have saved a life today, and that has to count for something." Marcus felt a wave of relief, though he knew his future with the Royal Guard was still uncertain. More importantly, he could see that Sarah and Emma were going to be okay. Janet was already making phone calls to arrange emergency housing, and the paramedic was preparing to transport both mother and child to a hospital for more thorough medical evaluations. As Sarah prepared to leave with the social worker, she looked back at Marcus one more time. The desperation that had marked her face earlier was gone, replaced by something that looked like gratitude mixed with hope. "Thank you," she called out to him. "Thank you for seeing us as people instead of just a problem to ignore." Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion, but he managed to nod in acknowledgement. This simple expression of thanks meant more to him than any commendation or recognition he had ever received in his military service. He had joined the Royal Guard to serve and protect people, and today he had done exactly that in the most direct way possible. The immediate crisis was over, but Marcus knew that both Sarah's story and his own were entering new chapters that neither of them could have anticipated when the morning began. 3 months later, Marcus Thompson stood once again at his post outside Buckingham Palace, but everything had changed. The formal investigation into his breach of protocol had concluded with an outcome that surprised everyone, including Marcus himself. Rather than facing disciplinary action, he had been commended for his quick thinking and humanitarian response to an emergency situation. The incident had sparked a broader conversation within the Royal Guard about the balance between maintaining traditional protocols and responding to human crises. New guidelines had been developed that gave guards more flexibility in situations involving public safety and welfare, particularly when children were involved. Marcus had become something of a celebrity within the service, though he was uncomfortable with the attention. He preferred to think of what he had done as simply being human in a moment when humanity was more important than regulations. The real hero of the story in his mind was Sarah Mitchell, who had found the courage to rebuild her life with the help she had finally received. Sarah and Emma had been placed in emergency housing within hours of the palace incident, and Janet Collins had worked tirelessly to connect them with longer-term resources. Sarah had enrolled in a job training program that included childcare services, allowing her to develop new skills while ensuring Emma was properly cared for during the day. The media attention surrounding the incident had brought unexpected opportunities as well. Several local businesses had reached out with job offers for Sarah, and a charitable foundation had provided funding for her to pursue additional education. The story of the desperate mother at the palace gates had resonated with people around the world, generating an outpouring of support that surprised everyone involved. Marcus had stayed in touch with Sarah and Emma throughout their recovery, visiting them occasionally when his duties permitted. Watching Emma grow from a frightened, undernourished infant into a healthy, happy baby had been one of the most rewarding experiences of his life. Sarah had transformed as well, regaining the confidence and hope that poverty and desperation had nearly destroyed. On this particular morning, as Marcus stood at his familiar post, he noticed a familiar figure approaching through the crowd of tourists. Sarah was walking toward the palace gates, but this time her posture was completely different. She walked with confidence and purpose, carrying Emma in a proper baby carrier, instead of a desperate bundle of cloth. Sarah approached Marcus's position and smiled warmly. Emma, now 6 months old, was alert and curious, looking around at the world with bright, healthy eyes. The contrast with the frightened, desperate woman who had nearly abandoned her baby at this same spot was remarkable. "I wanted to thank you, again," Sarah said, speaking quietly so as not to draw attention from other tourists. "Emma and I are doing well. I have a job now, working as an administrative assistant at a legal firm. We have our own apartment and Emma goes to a wonderful daycare center." Marcus felt his chest swell with pride and happiness. This was the outcome he had hoped for when he first broke protocol to speak to her, but seeing it actually happen was almost overwhelming. Sarah and Emma had not just survived their crisis, they were thriving. "I'm so glad to hear that," Marcus replied, his voice warm despite the formal setting. "Emma looks wonderful. She's grown so much." "She has no idea how close she came to a very different life," Sarah said, looking down at her daughter with obvious love. "Sometimes I think about what would have happened if you hadn't spoken to me that day. If you had just followed the rules and let me walk away." Marcus had thought about that scenario many times over the past 3 months, and it always, made him feel sick. Sarah would have disappeared into the city, probably blaming herself for abandoning Emma. The baby would have ended up in the foster care system, possibly never knowing why her mother had given her up. 2 lives would have been permanently damaged by circumstances that were ultimately changeable. "The important thing is that it didn't happen," Marcus said. "You found the strength to accept help, and Emma has her mother where she belongs." Emma babbled happily and reached toward Marcus, her tiny fingers grasping at the air. Sarah laughed and adjusted her position so the baby could see him better. She likes you, Sarah observed. I think she remembers your voice from that day. You were the first person to offer us hope when everything seemed hopeless. Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion, just as it had during the original incident. He had joined the Royal Guard to serve and protect, but he had never imagined that his most important act of service would involve breaking the very rules he had sworn to uphold. Other tourists were beginning to notice the interaction between the guard and the young mother, but Marcus no longer felt the rigid constraint of absolute protocol. The new guidelines allowed for human interaction in appropriate circumstances, and this reunion definitely qualified. Will you keep in touch? Sarah asked. I'd like Emma to know the story of how a palace guard helped save her family when she's old enough to understand. Of course, Marcus replied. I'd be honored to be part of her story. Sarah smiled and began walking away, but she turned back one more time. You know, I used to think that people in positions like yours were just symbols, not real people with real feelings. What you did that day showed me that there's still humanity behind the uniforms and traditions. Thank you for being human when it mattered most. As Sarah and Emma disappeared into the crowd, Marcus resumed his formal stance, but his heart was full of satisfaction and hope. He had learned that sometimes the most important thing a person could do was recognize when rules needed to give way to compassion, when duty to an institution had to yield to duty to humanity. The tourists continued their usual attempts to make him react, but Marcus remained focused and professional. However, he now carried with him the knowledge that when it truly mattered, when lives hung in the balance, he was capable of being more than just a ceremonial figure. He was capable of being exactly the kind of protector and servant he had always aspired to be. The incident had changed not only his own perspective, but had rippled through the entire Royal Guard service. Training programs now included modules on recognizing and responding to humanitarian crises, and the story of Sarah and Emma had become part of the official curriculum for new recruits. Marcus often found himself speaking to trainee guards about the importance of balancing protocol with human compassion. His fellow guards had initially been shocked by his breach of protocol, but as the positive outcome became clear, their shock had turned to respect. Many confided in him that they had witnessed similar situations over the years, but had felt powerless to act due to rigid adherence to regulations. Marcus's actions had shown them that sometimes being a true guardian meant making difficult choices. The palace administration had also taken notice of the incident's implications. They had quietly established a fund to help visitors who found themselves in crisis situations, and social workers were now on call to respond to emergencies at the palace gates. The institution was learning to adapt its ancient traditions to modern humanitarian needs. As the months passed, Marcus received letters from people around the world who had been inspired by his story. Parents wrote to thank him for showing that individual actions could make a difference in the lives of families. Social workers and first responders shared their own stories of times when they had to choose between following procedures and following their conscience. But the most meaningful correspondence came from Sarah herself, who sent regular updates about Emma's development and her own progress. She had completed her job training program with honors and had been promoted at the legal firm where she worked. Emma was thriving in daycare and had already said her first word, which, according to Sarah's letter, sounded remarkably like Marcus. The Baba story had also caught the attention of charitable organizations working with homeless families. Several had reached out to Marcus to serve as a spokesperson for their causes, recognizing that his unique perspective as both a symbol of authority and an advocate for the vulnerable could help raise awareness about family homelessness. Marcus had accepted some of these opportunities, speaking at fundraising events and awareness campaigns during his time off. He found that sharing Sarah and Emma's story helped people understand that homelessness could happen to anyone, and that small acts of kindness and intervention could have enormous consequences. The royal family itself had privately commended Marcus for his actions, though this recognition was never made public. A senior palace official had quietly informed him that his decision to prioritize human welfare over protocol was entirely consistent with the royal family's own values and charitable commitments. As Marcus stood at his post that morning, watching the familiar flow of tourists and continuing his duties, He reflected on how one moment of moral courage had transformed multiple lives. Sarah and Emma were building a secure future together. The Royal Guard service had evolved to become more responsive to human needs, and Marcus himself had discovered that true service sometimes required the courage to break rules in service of higher principles. The experience had taught him that protocols and traditions were important, but they should serve human dignity rather than supersede it. The uniform he wore,